Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another session of MI212. We're going to continue on this week with the advanced PK/PD topics. We'll finish up with the topic session number 2. We had one brief piece of that left. And then we will move into advanced topics 3, which will go through mechanistic modeling, multiscale modeling, and the like. And so I actually wanted to start off today by going through one set of questions. Susan Willivice had posted a few questions to the discussion forum. Susan and to everyone else following those questions, I'll get back to the second piece of those either at the end of this lecture or on Friday. But one piece that I did want to touch on here is the question about whether you can have in the transit compartment models, if you can have a separate term describing the transit versus the death rate of these cells as far as identifiability. To the best of my knowledge, you actually cannot, unless you have different observations within different parts of this chain. It's very difficult to get any estimate of the death rate to be different from the transit rate. If you believe that there's some difference, then I think what you need to do is fix this value. And in fact, this is the Gupta paper that I had referred to last week. If you go into this paper and actually look at how this model was parameterized, they ended up, scroll down here, fixing that removal term right here. So their K-circ term, they ended up actually fixing at a value of 6.7 hours. And so hopefully that helps to clarify that. Again, there were some other questions in regards to the transit PK model for delayed absorption. And again, we'll touch on those either at the end of this lecture or I'll either write back on the forum or provide answers on Friday. Okay. So we had in the last week's lecture, we had talked about different ways of developing these indirect or turnover models to describe a tolerance development and a rebound. And we did that through the precursor pool type model. And then we also discussed ways of delaying effects, and that was done through the use of the transit compartment models. Another way that I wanted to make everyone aware of that has been done and can be done to represent these delays in response is through what's been termed lifespan models. Now, we showed a way last week where by using the transit compartment models, you can actually parameterize those in terms that give you estimates of what the lifespan of those cells are. We talked about that with the megakaryocytes as well as with the platelets and together in that one example. The way that they're done in these, again, what are called lifespan models, that's how they were termed in the publications of these, is more or less a delayed differential equation. So you're putting a delay time. These TR and the TD is the normal expected lifespan of a cell, for example. And then the TD is the new expected lifetime. And you're more or less just offsetting the differential equation below based on the relative size of TR to TD. So the nice thing about that is that you can actually, based on what TD is, you can either have it be that the lifespan is now prolonged, so that that cell lives longer, in which case TD would be greater than TR, or in the case of, for example, a cytotoxic agent, you would have the new lifespan of that cell being shorter than the original expected lifespan, TR. And so once you've reached the time of the delay, then those new cells would start to take over that new lifespan. Now, the one difference, I guess, if you will, between these models and the transit compartment models that we looked at yesterday or last week, if you recall, just showing the PK example here, is that even though you're delaying the full onset of action with the transit compartment models, there's still some trickling, if you will, of effect that starts to occur, and then it's not until some later time that you get to where your full response is. But for some period of time during that delay, there is some response occurring. With these lifespan models, it's more or less just an on-off switch, that you've got absolutely no change in response up until that delay occurs in the differential equation, determined by the difference in time between, so T in this equation is your running clock time, TR is your normal response time, and then there's TD. And so the time at which that effect begins to occur is determined, again, by the relative difference between TR and TD. And there are different ways of interpreting when that response occurs, depending on whether you're looking at cytotoxic agents and anti-apoptotic agents. And I'd refer everyone back to the two references 40 and 41 here, if you are interested in implementing one of these models. It's no small task to actually get one of these things into a program like NONMEM, because there's no direct way of writing delayed differential equations within NONMEM. It can be done. The code is available within reference 43 here. I didn't go and copy it directly back into the notes because it is available within the reference. It is, and I'll stress it, it's extremely difficult to write one of these models within NONMEM. It doesn't give you that much different than what you'll get from a transit compartment model. In fact, if you add enough transit compartments, it's actually been shown that you can mimic essentially what these lifespan models are doing. Oftentimes that's a more efficient approach, and from a code writing standpoint, it's much easier to do too for the modeler. And again, as we showed last week, you can parameterize these transit compartment models so that you can get the same type of information as far as, the lifespan, the normal lifespan, and then the lifespan affected by drug, using the transit compartment model. So I'm not going to go a lot into exactly what these lifespan models are. Again, they're useful, but practicality-wise, they're very tough to implement, and I don't think they get you much beyond the transit compartment models. And again, it's generally the case from the pharmacodynamic data that I've seen that you start to see some trickling of effect early on, rather than period of time where there's absolutely no effect, and then all of a sudden there's an effect. And again, if you look at the publications on this, you see the predicted lines where, again, there's a complete flat delay, and then all of a sudden an effect. If you look at the data, even the data oftentimes looks as though maybe there was something starting already before that on-off switch occurred within the delayed differential. So again, I wanted to make everyone available of the models, of their availability, of the availability of the code, should you choose to try to implement one. But I would typically defer to a different form of the model. Somebody had asked about the problem that we went through on Friday. I will post up the answer, if you will, or my solution to that problem after class today or tomorrow. Okay, and so again, I would, just answering a quick question here, I would recommend using a transit compartment model instead of the lifespan model, if possible. If you run into a situation where your data clearly show that there's a flat response until a certain future period of time, that's when you may want to go down the avenue of a delayed differential. So. Okay, so moving on from there, we're going to now go into what we're calling topics 3. And this is dealing with mechanistic or multiscale models and multiple endpoint data. Now, the way that I have this set of lecture notes set up is I'm going to go through some background just to make sure everybody's familiar with the nomenclature of these types of models. There are a lot of terms that are typically thrown around when we talk about these models. We talk about mechanistic models. There's, you hear a lot about systems biology models now and multiscale models. And so what I'd like to do is spend a few minutes to just try to pull those all together to show you, at least in my view, they're all one and the same. Give an introduction to why we may want to pursue these types of models, go through an example of a fairly substantially sized one of these multiscale models that we've recently published. Not so much from the code perspective, but again from the perspective of why you may want to embark on developing a model of this size and this scale. And then what we'll do is we'll go into the problem for this week, where I've set up a hypothetical case of CETP inhibition, in which we'll really pull together information from a lot of the past lectures, including some of the PK target-mediated drug disposition work, and tie that into multiple endpoints and multiple outcomes to show how those would be. So that this is where we get into the actual coding and data structure, etc., through the example given at the end of this lecture. Okay, so depending on how familiar you are with these, I figured I'd give you a quick overview of the different terminologies that are used here, the nomenclatures. I think most of us are probably fairly familiar with mechanistic modeling. We often talk about pharmacodynamic models being empirical, which are more just the fitting straight lines or maybe splines through sets of data, where there's really just data driven and no real reason behind why we choose one mathematical expression over another other than it fits the data. So those are more the empirical approaches, whereas a mechanistic approach really goes back to things like receptor theory and mass transport and other pharmacologic and physiologic principles to really drive which models we choose based on what we believe is going on within the body, and how that's being affected by drug and by disease. And so in a broadest sense, that's what we talk about when we talk about mechanistic modeling. You'll see oftentimes the literature semi-mechanistic, where we're realizing that we're making some simplifications to what's actually occurring, but it's all in the interest of starting to describe what's going on with the biological system. Now, sort of parallel to our evolution into these mechanistic and semi-mechanistic pharmacodynamic models, there is a discipline of biology called systems biology, which interestingly does a lot of the same things that we've been doing as we develop these mechanistic models. So in systems biology, they're looking to quantify interactions between biological components. Now, oftentimes this is done on a more microscopic scale than what we're used to, where they'll be looking at signaling pathways within cells, maybe moving up into how different enzyme systems and such work, but oftentimes it's been on a fairly small scale, although that's really been expanding within the last few years as well. When you get into systems biology talk, oftentimes they talk about things being either top down or bottom up or middle out. And really what that refers to is where they're starting from and where they want to go. So if there's a outcome measure that they're looking at and they have a fairly good idea of how to describe that dynamically and quantitatively, yet they're trying to then drill down from that outcome into the actual signaling pathways and biochemistry affecting that, that's when they talk about going top down. If they understand the biochemistry, maybe some of the cell signaling, but they want to go up and figure out what's happening on a cellular or organ or physiome level, then they talk about doing a bottom-up approach. If they are somewhere in the middle and they want to expand the model both ways, then they talk about a middle-out approach. And again, as we've been sort of evolving our side of things to describe things in a more biologic context, the systems biologists have been doing the same thing and actually going up into entire physiomes, cardiac level, etc. And so there's actually been some meetings recently at the National Institutes of Health where we've brought together some of the systems biology work along with the quantitative pharmacology and what we're now calling oftentimes systems pharmacology groups to sort of share our learnings from each side. And so we've had 2 of those workshops now. So if people are interested in this type of work, there's a sort of a burgeoning field in this. I encourage everyone to look into it further. Hopefully with the example I gave you today, you'll have a bit more feel as well as to what this can and can do and some of the challenges to getting it done. So mechanistic and systems biology, again, they're really evolving into one and the same. Another thing that you'll hear talked about is multiscale models. Now, multiscale models are again, the same thing. What that means is that you're developing a model that represents different levels of physiology. They may be all the way down to atomic scales, not typically, but you could envision that. Cellular, subcellular, all the way up into population models and really outcomes type models. And so when you hear, and there's numerous grant opportunities out there for developing these types of models as well. So again, when you hear somebody talking about mechanistic models, systems biology models, although the field of systems biology is a very broad field and there are some still some very distinct wet lab components to this. But again, all of these models really can be lumped into many of the same principles and concepts. So why do we do this? What's important? It's a lot of work. You'll see, and what do we hope to get out of it? And really, it's a question of developing these models not to answer questions necessarily within just a drug development program or even a therapeutic area. It's really about understanding the entirety of the system. Gives you, and really you're not understanding about the drug or using the model to understand the drug. You're using the drug, other drugs, and other diseases to try to understand the system itself. So it's generally thought of as a much broader scope than we would consider for our normal drug development sort of paradigms of you get results from a study, you model them, and you move on. This is, you have a model in place, you use data from a given study or a given disease to try to learn more about that model, and you then use that to guide your further development or further understanding of biology and of the disease and of the therapeutic. Now, one thing that a lot of these models are evolving into and don't necessarily have right now, and the example that we'll look at today is a case in point, is that these models are so complicated that it's often very difficult to incorporate the correct degrees of population variability as well as model uncertainty, parameter uncertainty. There are certainly research efforts that are looking into these pieces. We're developing some examples within WinBug so that we can understand both sets of variants here, both the population variability, residual variability, and these impact of parameter uncertainty. And it's something to keep in mind as you're developing these models. The data that you need to develop one of these models is immense, to say the least. You need preclinical data, you need oftentimes cellular level, etc., as well as a good clinical understanding, or ideally some clinical understanding. If not, you're trying to bridge this information into clinical understanding. And generally, you don't just need a Western blot at 4 hours. You need longitudinal data in order to be able to kinetically understand the system, which it seems pretty obvious probably to all of us, but when you go back and you look at some of the studies that you would hope to get data from, you realize that they don't have the data that you need. And so if you're working in a situation where you're trying to develop these types of models, and you've got a non-clinical group that you're working with as well as a clinical group, you certainly want to have a hand in study design so that you get the right data out. I already talked about this panoramic focus. You want these models to do more than just describe the data at hand. You want them to be able to give you a description and an understanding of multiple markers or multiple scales of marker, again through maybe cell signaling up to outcomes type models or variables. And then the really nice piece about this is that you can then apply this to various disease and drug conditions. I had, I think, given the example last week where we were developing the model for thrombocytopenia, where we had a drug that was affecting the development of megakaryocytes. And we talked about the fact that, so if you develop that model, for example, in healthy volunteers, you may then be able to use it and alter certain input parameters to mimic not just what's happening in healthy volunteers, but what you could expect in different etiologies of thrombocytopenia, be it chemotherapy-induced or autoimmune-induced, and you would do that by altering different parameters within that model. And so again, that's an example where if you take a mechanistic model, one that's fairly descriptive or very descriptive of biological processes, and you then know how different disease states may affect that model, that actual biologic system, the model becomes much more useful and applicable to different as of yet studied conditions. Another piece in here for tool evolution, there's a lot to be done. Things like NONMEM are not exactly the best tools for these types of models. There's computational needs that you have to consider when you go to Bayesian methodologies, etc. And so really there's a need here for us to guide this tool evolution as we develop these models. So what are these sort of systems or physiologic or multiscale models? What do they look like? I've given here a schematic of a model put together describing the cardiovascular system. I'm going to keep this small on purpose because we're not going to go into different parts of this, but this was a model that was put together by Arthur Guyton, one of the forefathers of physiology research. If you notice the publication date on this, back in 1969. From what I've read on this, this was actually put together on one of these original computers where they're hooking together vacuum tubes and such. And Dr. Guyton was able to, from this, actually purport different mechanisms and different implications of renal physiology, etc., on cardiovascular disease states. And just to show that we're still 42 years later running into a lot of the same barriers, I guess, if you will, of presenting these types of mathematical models and running into certain barriers of people believing exactly what's coming out of them. I provided a quote here, which was actually put into Dr. Guyton's obituary. When he first presented this mathematical model, responses reflected a tone of disbelief, even sarcasm, and this was a very well-respected researcher. And so he had actually predicted this role of renal pressure mechanisms within blood pressure regulation, which today we take for granted. But at the time, he was more or less laughed at for developing this from this really remarkable model, especially given the fact that it was 42 years ago on minimal compute resource. And so I put this up here for a few reasons. One is that this concept of developing these mathematical models isn't new. This has been done. In some ways, we're kind of gone backwards. If this is what we were able to do 42 years ago, it's pretty amazing. The other piece is that in that 42 years, we really haven't added much to this. Many of the physiologic models that are out there, they're out there. They're not publicly out there, and so we really need to add to this body of research if we want to move this field onward. And so as an example of this, I'll go through the bone and calcium model that we've recently published. Hopefully give you a flavor for what some of these models can do. Again, talk about the sort of extended scope that you develop the model for one thing, but it has applicability to several different mechanisms and disease states. And so we'll start just with a little bit of background here and why this is important. Well, calcium is vital for numerous functions within the body, most notably within things like the well, any muscle tissue, but obviously the heart then has to maintain very, very tight calcium concentrations to remain viable for the proper calcium gating, etc. If calcium levels go too high, the muscles misfire. If they go too low, the muscles misfire. In either case, you cease to exist. And so the extracellular fluid, or the plasma calcium or serum calcium, is maintained generally within about 10% of a person's sort of set point, if you will, which is very, very tight regulation. And so the body's developed a lot of different mechanisms in order to do this, because it has to. Coupled with that is the need for calcium within the bone. The bone requires calcium for structure and strength, and without that, then you run into situations of osteoporosis and in its related sequelae. Now, one point to make is that if you run into a situation where one of these is out of balance, because of the immediate importance within the plasma, you'll actually lose calcium out of the bone. That's why with age we tend to lose calcium, because the body, not that it doesn't care, but it cares less about bone than it does about its heart. And so we have developed mechanisms to allow for that appropriate balance. So the objective of the model itself, what I'm going to do here is go through a little bit of background as to how we actually put this thing together. Again, not specifically just for this example, but really if you were to do this for any real case, how would you go about doing it? What types of information would you look for, existing models, etc., that you could use to develop one of these models? And so first of all, the goals. You want to develop a model that represents physiology. We've been through that. In this case, you want something that predicts calcium homeostasis. That's that balance of calcium within the extracellular fluid. And at the same time, it's got to be able to describe bone remodeling. And you then want it to be able to forecast therapeutics related to bone, as well as various disease states. And we'll go through a couple of examples of those as well. You want this to be able to do so longitudinally, so over time. You want it to incorporate those relevant physiologic factors that you'll be measuring, and that will also be inherent within the biology and inner workings of other disease states. Examples of that are phosphate, PTH, calcitriol, turnover markers, and other cytokines. So I guess, again, a little bit of history. The model itself was originally developed by myself and Mark Peterson. Mark was at the time working at Amgen, and Amgen had in development a drug called denosumab, which was a rank ligand inhibitor. We'll get in a little bit more into the mechanism there. And so they were looking at bone-related changes, and there were some indications that there were changes going on, or compensatory, if you will, changes going on within calcium homeostasis. So typically, one way we would have considered modeling this in the past is we would have said, okay, well, let's develop a model that describes the bone resorption. Let's develop a model that describes the bone formation. Let's develop a model that describes the PTH changes. Let's develop a model that describes the calcium changes. And you've had 4 or 5 models that all existed separately, and you could describe the data at hand. But one thing that Mark had brought to us was the idea that all these things are linked somehow. Why don't we just develop a model that describes the entirety of the system? And at the time, there were available a few different models that described separate pieces of this, but nothing described the whole thing together. So a question was, could we take a lot of the parameter estimates from these different models, modify and expand them based on other literature, integrate the structure from the different models, and inherent in this as well is to make sure that, for example, if PTH started at a value of X in one model, it had to be calibrated so that it would start at that value in a different model, so everything would have the same initial condition and initial set points, and then estimate some of those parameters that had been added to describe different therapeutic interventions. And so part of the fitting process was that we used data describing anabolic therapeutics. So this was the case of once daily PTH administration. There was a bunch of data out there available for that. The anti-resorptive therapeutic was denosumab, and so we had data available for that. Again, this is all, and is at this time, it's all publicly available data. And the original models were publicly available as well. And then further research to determine what happens under various disease states. Now, I mentioned before that NONMEM isn't necessarily the best modeling software for doing these types of models. One fairly easy to use piece of software that we'd come across when we first started this was Berkeley Madonna. Very easy to write things like differential equations in here, define different parameters, and importantly to simulate from Berkeley Madonna to get a feel for what's going on with each of these variables, sensitivity of variables, and then the longitudinal changes in numerous variables at once without having to go into, for example, a NONMEM control stream and tabling out a different set of variables every time you want to look at something else. It's much more straightforward within Berkeley. And so that was the software that we had used at the time. I mentioned previously that oftentimes these models are developed what's called deterministically, so there's no variability included within them. That was the case of the original model here. We're now looking to port this over into other software platforms that will allow for easier incorporation of that, such as WinBugs. So the model itself, again, there were the three sort of underpinning models, if you will. There was also a huge literature review that was undertaken as part of this model development. Over 200 references, probably much more than that now. Numerous data sources, journals, regulatory documents, textbooks, etc. Publications dating back into the 1950s. And so really numerous decades, 5 decades at least, of biological research that went into the model. Interestingly, a lot of the physiologic work actually came from, much like the publication by Guyton in 1969 and 72, a lot of the data and the model parameters for things like how calcium and calcitriol, et cetera, affect the parathyroid gland came from physiologic research that was done in the 1960s and 1970s. And using the methodologies back there, they'd actually derived and published the physiologic relationships and the mathematical relationships describing those. So again, this is a matter of going back and determining all this information from the literature. The three models that I talked about, there was a model on calcium homeostasis. They call it a minimal model here. It was actually fairly involved. The one thing that it didn't do was it didn't consider any changes occurring from the bone or any calcium changes to and from the bone, and so that was a limitation of that model. There was another model that was available that described the bone side of things, so how activities in the osteoblast, the blast, you can think of the B for building bone, and the clasts, the C here you can think of as chewing up bone. So blasts are bone forming, clasts are bone resorbing cells, and they're both involved in a continuous turnover of bone, so that your the bone that is within your body is it's a living organ, obviously, and so it's not just built and it stays there. It's constantly being renewed and rejuvenated through these cellular processes. Finally, there was a sort of a hypothetical model, or I guess a qualitative model, trying to describe the effects of parathyroid hormone. And this is really what's been considered a bit of a paradoxical effect until we're now starting to understand a little bit more about the signaling systems, is that when people have prolonged elevations in parathyroid hormone, they tend to lose bone. So you fall into a situation where your osteoclast activities go way up without a considerable increase in the osteoblastic activities, and so you lose bone. In the other case, when you give parathyroid hormone once a day, as I mentioned before, that's actually an anabolic therapeutic. So both your blast and clast activities go up, but your the relative amount of bone formation is greater than the relative amount of bone resorption, and so you actually end up building bone. And there's a parathyroid product out there that's given once daily for that purpose. There had never been a way of describing that or understanding why, elevated, again, chronic elevations lead to bone loss, whereas once a day administration leads to bone formation. And so, using, again, a sort of an understanding of what's going on within this pathway, this actually had to do with the apoptotic pathway for the osteoblast. We were able to develop a mathematical expression that when you input into the model prolonged PTH increases, you would see this differential change in bone markers, whereas when you put in the intermittent or once daily PTH, because of the kinetic differences in the signaling pathway, you would actually get the anabolic effects that have been observed clinically. And so again, that's a matter of taking all of this information together, putting it all together, and getting it into a model that describes these different therapeutic conditions. So there's a question here. If I understand you correctly, in your model, many of the parameter values are fixed based on literature. That's true. So a lot of this information is cumulative, and again, so there's no way that you could run a given study to get all of the information that's available within any one of these sort of multiscale models, if you will. So a few things for the modeling process. We merged the different models. There were also numerous expansions and modifications, including development of the allowance of oral dosing for calcium and phosphate, bioavailability changes, particularly with calcium. As you're probably all aware, calcium has an inherent feedback on vitamin D. As far as how much calcium gets absorbed, that wasn't in the original model. And actually, there's a piece that was in there where you deal with the conversion of the vitamin D that we typically take in our body to calcitriol, which is the active form of vitamin D. And that active form actually then feeds back to alter the number of active transporters within the gut to allow for either increases or decreases in oral calcium or calcium bioavailability. Things like TGF-beta, which is one of the cell signaling pathways inherent in regulating osteoblast and osteoclast differentiation, had to be put into the model. At the time of that, the Lemaire model that I had given the reference for on the previous slide, that model was developed at a time when this rank ligand OPG system was really only first beginning to be understood. Research since that model indicated that there were dependencies of osteoclast survival on rank ligand, so things like that. Again, this is kind of shows where you can take existing models, pieces of existing models, and continue to update them as our understanding of these processes evolve. And so we built that component in as well. The original calcium homeostasis model that was developed by Raposo et al. They used a lot of, I'll say engineering mathematics, where they use things like hyperbolic tangent functions that provide a lot of the same sort of functional responses that we may see from our hyperbolic Emax type relationships. However, a lot of those functions are sort of capped, if you will, based on minimums and maximums. And so we ended up going back and reworking a lot of those into, again, these Emax relationships where going backwards, you can develop these right back into receptor theory. You can derive them from receptor theory. So again, they're thought to be much more representative of true physiology. And because of that, they have minimums and maximums and shapes and slopes that are generally represent physiology better than the tangential functions. We also went back and reparameterized things like renal excretion and the more typical types of notations that we're used to. So filtration, secretion, reabsorption. Again, they were in part within these models, but they weren't within there in what we consider the more true representations of physiology and more interpretable representations of physiology. So this is the sort of a cartoon, if you will, of the model itself. I mentioned before that there's a component in there where you can alter the amount of oral intake of calcium and phosphate, the amount of the bioavailability fraction of calcium based on calcitriol. Calcitriol comes in through vitamin D, converted in the kidney with 1-alpha hydroxylase. There's feedback for calcium and calcitriol to the parathyroid gland to affect how much parathyroid hormone is released into circulation. Parathyroid hormone is really one of the main regulators, if you will. I mentioned before that the body has developed all these systems to maintain a very tight balance on the amount of calcium within this extracellular fluid. The ways that it does that are it either changes the amount coming in or the amount going out of calcium. And so the amount coming in can be changed two different ways. One is by decreasing the amount of calcium that's absorbed from the diet. And PTH in this sense feeds back to alter the amount of active vitamin D that's created. PTH, the other way that calcium can get into the extracellular fluid is through the bone, back out from the bone. PTH is a very strong component of regulation of this rank-rank ligand OPG system, as well as the apoptotic system of osteoblasts, as I mentioned previously. And so again, PTH affects the input both from there to there. The amount that goes back into the bone is again regulated by PTH because of its indirect relationships with the osteoblast and osteoclast activity. And then finally, and this is actually the sort of the first responder, if you will, when the body starts to notice that calcium levels are going either too high or too low, is there's an almost immediate feedback because calcium feeds back, changes the amount of PTH that's available in the plasma extracellular fluid. I should note that PTH has a half-life of about 5 minutes, so this PT gland through these calcium sensing receptors can alter the amount, either decrease or increase the amount of PTH in very rapid fashion. That feeds back to the reabsorption of calcium within the renal tubules, and it either will spill more or less all of the calcium that's filtered from the plasma into the urine, or conversely, it'll entirely shut off reabsorption so that no calcium is lost to the urine, thereby sparing calcium within the extracellular fluid. So again, that's the sort of the immediate way that the body affects these calcium changes. Secondary to that is it within a matter of hours to days, it can upregulate this or downregulate the amount coming in from the diet, and then more long term it tends to affect the amount coming into and leaving the bone. So looks really complicated. No way you can develop this so that it actually works mathematically. I thought that too at first, I have to admit, but amazingly, again, because there's literally decades worth of research. There were a lot of these, I mentioned, sort of clamp studies done back in the 60s and 70s, where they would infuse calcium and actually look immediately at the response of the parathyroid gland as to its production of PTH. And so again, a lot of that, and then conversely, or at the same time, they would look at the amount of calcium coming in and out of the urine through catheterization, etc. And so a lot of these, seems complicated, but a lot of the data and even the mathematical expressions were already available to describe many of these components. So the model itself right now describes a lot of different therapeutic scenarios. I had mentioned before it was originally developed for denosumab. We'll look at that. During the development for that, it was useful to actually pull in the data for this once daily PTH administration. The question was, could we then differentiate that once daily with the continuous PTH? And so those data, or that disease state, was brought in as well for people with primary hyperparathyroidism. Another interesting piece of this, and this was almost, hey, I wonder if it can work for this too, is we wanted to see if we took within this model, we took the glomerular filtration rate here and had it slowly decline over time, what would the subsequent effect be of decrease in this filtration on the rest of the system? So as, for example, phosphate levels go up, it's going to then go back and feed back into the amount of, or the activity of the 1-alpha hydroxylase, which is going to affect calcitriol. Calcitriol is going to affect the amount of calcium absorbed. It's going to feed back to the PT gland, and then how does that manifest into the bone system? And can this actually describe what truly occurs during this development of renal insufficiency? And then extending that even further, can we use the model to explore exactly how or mechanisms by which estrogen affects the bone and calcium balance as well. So the first example here is the administration of the rank ligand inhibitor, and so this really is where a lot of this started. And so the mechanism of action here is that rank ligand inhibition, and I'll just shoot back up to the cartoon here of the model, is that when you inhibit rank ligand, there's a requirement here on osteoclasts for the rank on osteoclasts to be bound to rank ligand on osteoblasts. And really what this is saying is that physiologically, if you've got a cell that's marching along the bone, chewing it up, you want a cell behind it filling the hole in the pavement, if you will. And so if osteoclasts exist and they're hanging this rank ligand off of themselves and there's not an osteoblast behind it ready to fill in the pavement, then that osteoclast shouldn't be there. And so there's actually an emerging field of biology here that shows that without this interaction between rank and rank ligand expressed on osteoblasts and osteoclasts, that number one, the osteoclast precursors fail to differentiate into osteoclasts or fully functioning osteoclasts, and additionally, those osteoclasts that exist will undergo a more rapid rate of apoptosis. And so the idea was that if you inhibit rank ligand, you're going to have all these osteoclasts die off. You're going to decrease the amount of bone resorption, and therefore you're going to get an increase in overall bone. And so that's what happens, but you can imagine that if you decrease the amount of bone that's being chewed up, you're actually going to then sort of secondarily decrease the amount of calcium that's being released from the bone back into circulation. And so one of the observations that was made during these studies was that there was actually a transient decrease in calcium in the plasma. Secondary to that, there was an increase in parathyroid hormone. And this was done really because, as I mentioned before, that parathyroid hormone is the sort of calcium sparing mechanism within the body through the different sites, if you will, the intestine, the kidney, and the bone. And by increasing that PTH production, it would then compensate the calcium balance. So again, when the data were available, it would have been easy enough to fit something that described osteoclasts, described osteoblasts, described calcium, and described PTH. But it was more informative, more descriptive if we could determine this model to describe the entirety of this system. And so, in fact, when we developed the model, put in the pharmacokinetic concentrations of denosumab affecting rank ligand, we were able to describe these observed changes in calcium, shown in the middle here. To this side showed that transient increase in PTH. The yellow here, the decreases in osteoclast markers, and in blue, the decreases in osteoblast markers. Now, these decreases in osteoblasts occurred because as you decrease the osteoclasts, you get the osteoclasts are actually responsible for the conversion of latent TGF-beta into its active form. And when you decrease osteoclasts, you decrease the amount of active TGF-beta, and that feeds back and alters the amount of osteoblasts that differentiate. And so again, this is one of those sort of internal checks and balances that that are within the physiology of bone here, and so it's a matter of being able to describe those mathematically so that you can understand how each of those is affecting the outcomes that you're observing. Now, one thing you'll notice is when you look at these osteoclasts, you can start to see a little bit of a rebound occurring. And when we took this model, we actually simulated it out and we said, okay, what happens when you stop dosing altogether? Because of things like precursor dependence on active TGF-beta and precursors, if you will, for osteoblasts from responding osteoblasts and osteoclasts from precursor osteoclasts. That model sort of has within it a lot of those same properties that we had discussed last week with precursor models, where there's an inherent tolerance and rebound effect. And we're actually starting to observe some of that within the clinical data. And so when we simulated out again what happened when you discontinued therapy, we actually saw a rebound in these markers up above baseline with a subsequent return. And much like Guyton, who was sort of shunned and laughed at for his system, there was a bit of disbelief that you'd see any such rebound until they completed a study where they actually stopped therapy. And lo and behold, in those treatments that they stopped therapy, there was a rebound up above baseline, and then with reintroduction of therapy, there was a decline again. So the question at hand was, the rebound in bone metabolism is observable and recoverable. Is it predictable? In this case, in fact, it was, because we had the appropriate description of the underlying physiology and the appropriate model structures for those to be able to account for and capture those. The next question was, can we actually use these markers to predict? Again, so if you were systems biology, you'd be looking at this as a bottom up. So we had the sort of the physiologic representation describing the bone markers. Can we then take it one step closer to, for example, a fracture risk being predicted by bone mineral density, or BMD here? And so this was an extension of the model from the publication from earlier this year, where we developed some additional differential equations describing lumbar spine BMD. The formation rate here was being driven by the relative change in the bone-specific alk phos as a marker of the osteoblast function, and CTX is a marker of the osteoclast function. So in other words, if you increase your osteoblast function, you're increasing your input of BMD. If you are increasing your C-telepeptide here, the CTX, you are increasing your resorption, or the chewing up, remember, of the bone. And so again, that's all done relative to where you were at baseline. And so the idea was, can we link these changes in osteoclast and osteoblast function and actually have a predictable or useful function to describe these longitudinal changes in BMD. All the while, simply by adding this one equation, do we get all of the other feedback that was inherent in the model that we showed before. Another thing I guess I meant to hit on earlier, and I haven't mentioned it yet, is that one piece that's inherent in the entirety of this model is that when we go to each one of these new diseases or therapeutics, we aren't refitting the entirety of the model. The model is a representation of physiology. There may be terms that are specific to that drug's pharmacologic effect that are fit to specific data. But all of the underlying relationships, for example, of calcium sensing receptors for parathyroid response, etc., those are all retained. So the model is built in a sense so that it's generalizable to each of these different conditions. This case where we're developing it further to describe BMD falls under that, where we're not changing the rest of the model. All we're doing is adding to it this expression for BMD. When we then compare this is showing a few more dose groups than we were looking at the figure above. For the prediction of CTX, which is the measure for bone resorption or osteoclast function, we can see that the model is in fact predicting, maybe even under-predicting a little bit, the inherent rebound in that response. We're able to do that, or I'm sorry, in this case, the tolerance, and then ultimately the rebound that you would see on discontinuation of treatment. In both the marker for osteoclast function as well as down below in the marker for osteoblast function. And then the BMD component of that we can actually use then to predict out what's occurring for BMD at each of those doses. The case here with the 60 milligram Q6 month, that treatment was continued on for 48 months. This was a case where I believe, I'd have to go back to the schematic on this, but at 24 weeks, patients were actually switched from the 14 milligrams to a 60 milligram Q6 month. In this case here, the treatment was discontinued and then reinstituted at 36 months, and so we can predict the off-treatment and then the retreatment effects. And in this particular treatment group, the treatment was discontinued at 24 months. And so again, the sort of off-treatment effects here. Now, one of the reasons for this I mentioned was that we're able to describe these tolerance and rebounds phenomenon is because we have those precursor type pool models within, sort of embedded within the broader model. One of those pieces I mentioned was that for the cytokine TGF beta. And let me just shoot back up to the schematic here just to give you another visualization of what TGF beta is doing. Recall that there's a latent form within the bone of TGF beta that's actually formed as a function of osteoblasts, and then osteoclasts, as they resorb bone, they actually end up converting this latent TGF beta into an active form. And so again, we've got a situation here where we've got a precursor pool feeding into a pool that then goes and feeds into determining the osteoblast and osteoclast function. And so what I've shown here in this final plot is a representation or a prediction of what those different levels look like. The dashed line here, remember last week we showed that buildup of that precursor pool. That's here, the dashed line, or the latent TGF beta. So over time that precursor pool is building up. You discontinue therapy, and that's what causes the rebound phenomenon. And then this gradual buildup is what feeds into the tolerance development as well. And so again, this is where having a model that describes the entirety of the system not only helps you describe the system, but also helps you understand why those changes are potentially occurring. Yeah, okay, so another example. So interestingly, when we want to take a model like this and say, okay, well, one of the big problems that we run into in the development of osteoporosis is women go through menopause, and during menopause the levels of endogenous estrogen decline fairly rapidly, and we know because of that, or associated with that there's a rapid loss in bone mineral density during before menopause, during the perimenopause, during menopause, and then that continues afterwards. Interestingly, when you go into the literature, we don't really know why that occurs. There's a lot of purported mechanisms. There's some literature that supports an involvement of estrogen on the TGF beta system. There's direct physiologic evidence that estrogen affects that reabsorption of calcium within the kidney, and so affects the amount of calcium that leaves the system out the urine. There's some evidence that it may affect that rank ligand OPG system, and there's also some evidence that estrogen may affect the apoptosis system for osteoblasts. And so in a sense you can use a model like this to help probe some of those effects and determine which of those changes would be kinetically consistent with observed clinical changes. And so this is an excerpt from a poster. If you're interested in more of this, I've given the link to the actual poster. But we were able to develop a relationship that described the longitudinal expected fractional change in estrogen over time relative to menopause development. And then we were able to feed that fractional change in estrogen into different mechanisms. So if estrogen affected TGF beta, there was also some exploration to see what would happen if it affected the rank ligand system. Just a side note that kinetically that wasn't consistent with what we observe, because if you recall if you look at the changes that occur when you affect that rank ligand system, those changes occur very quickly, whereas TGF beta changes much more slowly over time. The half-life of TGF beta is much longer than that associated with rank ligand OPG. And so again, you're able to sort of probe those different mechanisms to see which of those is kinetically distinct from what you actually observe clinically. And again, the rank ligand system effects just weren't consistent with what we observe clinically. We're able to change the effect of estrogen or estimate its effect on this osteoblast apoptotic system, able to integrate an effect into that. And interestingly, without this effect, I was having a terrible time fitting these data. I knew that this effect on renal calcium reabsorption occurred. I was hoping to kind of put the model together sequentially, if you will, of probing the effects on these different systems first, and then adding in the effect on reabsorption. It wasn't until I actually included this that I could get a model that would estimate the actual observed changes. And so again, that kind of helps to show the importance of this effect. And from a therapeutic sense, you often hear of the importance of women taking additional calcium supplementation during menopause. It's not just because you have additional calcium coming out of the bone. It's also because you have additional calcium being lost by the body to the urine because of these physiologic changes within the kidney. Again, there've been there's direct published evidence that's associated with these estrogen changes. So again, it's not until you understand the entirety of the system that you can begin to describe this. And when we do this, we can actually look at the observed and predicted changes in these bone markers over time during, and you can see the degree to which this increase changes during the time of menopause, and then the effects of, in this case, the introduction of hormone replacement therapy on those markers, and then what happens once you discontinue that. Now, another interesting piece to this is that you can take it one step further, and we talked before about having these models and having outputs from them representative of multiscale. So in this case, all of this work was done really looking at the effect on bone markers. We've done some subsequent work with BMD changes. But really, it's interesting when you have a model like this to be able to say, okay, well, what's happening with PTH as well, and those other components of the model, as well as, for example, plasma calcium. And so you can see here an increase in PTH over time. Subsequent to that too is a change in TGF beta, but really we can't really measure that, but we can measure PTH. A slight decline in plasma calcium levels, although it's, again, the body has to maintain those levels, and so the decline is very minimal. And we can then compare those changes back to what is actually observed clinically. To see sort of as almost a secondary model evaluation, if you will. We use this set of data to sort of fit and understand what's going on with the bone side of things. Does what's going on within the model on the calcium side of things make sense as well clinically? And I actually have a comparison down here. I won't go through all the numbers, but you can actually show that what the model is predicting is actually very consistent with clinical observations. So what do you do with the model then? Well, you can use it to actually then start to look at different effects of disease progression. So when we talk about these disease progression models, one way to do it is to fit a straight line or maybe a spline or something and simulate from that. To me, it's a lot more interesting if you can use a model like this to then say, okay, what happens to somebody that goes through menopause at the age of 45, 50, or 55? What's their expected change in estrogen look like? What's their expected change in PTH? And then the bone markers as well. And then you can start to, if you can imagine, simulating a population of individuals going through menopause at different times and have a representative data set of women with, again, a representative description of what's going on physiologically. So this is, again, that's just a summary of that. If people are interested, there's the poster is online, and if you read through this and have any questions, just let me know. One final example, not to beat a dead horse on this, but again, just to show the utility of a model like this once you develop it. And again, in a simpler sense, going back to the example from last week with megakaryocytes and platelets, where when you get these models and you get them to a point where they're describing what's actually occurring biologically, I think you start to understand how useful these things can be to not just describe the problem at hand, but to describe situations that you can tie to the problem at hand, and you can also diverge from the problem at hand to address other questions and supplement your understanding of the system. And so the final example here is again another one of disease progression. Can the model predict bone-related changes manifested by progressive loss of kidney function? So going back and sort of breaking down that schematic that we looked at early on, when your kidneys start to fail, you lose glomerular filtration rate, so you get a decrease in GFR. Because of that, you get less phosphate being cleared. When you decrease the amount of phosphate that's being cleared, you get an increase of phosphate in the plasma. And this phosphate actually then ends up feeding back and inhibiting this enzyme process for 1-alpha hydroxylase, which is involved in the conversion of vitamin D, so the vitamin D3 that you may take through your diet, into its active form, calcitriol. And when you decrease the amount of calcitriol, you actually get a feedback. Calcitriol inversely affects the parathyroid gland. And you can think about this in a healthy state. If you don't have a lot of calcitriol, you're not absorbing a lot of calcium, right? Because calcitriol is what feeds back to the gut and allows for an increase in absorption of calcium from the gut. So if you're in a state where you have vitamin D, you're not going to have a lot of calcitriol. So it's going to feed back to the parathyroid gland, and it's going to say, make me some more PTH because I need to retain more calcium from being spilled into the urine. And additionally, I need less calcium going into the bone and potentially more coming out. Again, in this whole idea of trying to maintain that very tight calcium balance within the extracellular fluid. So it makes sense why there's this component, but what happens in this particular disease state, you get a decrease in this calcitriol. That actually then feeds back, tells the parathyroid gland to increase the amount of PTH. And because of that, these patients then oftentimes go on to develop secondary hyperparathyroidism. If you recall, when there's a prolonged elevation in parathyroid hormone, that through the bone side of thing ends up feeding back, increasing the amount of rank ligand expression. That rank ligand is what hooks into the osteoclasts and tells the osteoclasts, hey, I need more of you, number one, and B, you're fine to live longer, number two, don't go down the road of apoptosis as often. And so you get this this marked response and increase in osteoclast function, and so you end up losing bone. So on top of the fact that you're undergoing chronic renal failure, you're also now in a case of osteodystrophy. So what we did was we actually found a paper that had a lot of the pertinent data in it, this paper by Ricks et al. Looked at the model, sort of imposed a situation of what if we had a person that had a GFR of 100 mils per minute, and 10 years later that had dropped to, I believe, about 10, maybe 12 mils per minute. What happens relative to change in phosphate? How does that feed into an increase in parathyroid hormone and a decrease in calcitriol, and subsequent to that, a marked elevation in osteoclast function? And so, in fact, the model is able to predict this manifestation. And we've since gone on and used the model to predict from these changes in bone markers the observed changes in BMD, again reported by Ricks. I'm presenting this next week down at APS, in which case I'll update the slides to put the figures in. I didn't know if there are any embargoes or whatever of presenting before the meeting, so I didn't want to put that in yet. But I'll update the meeting notes to show that soon as well. So again, this isn't why we developed the model, yet it's a very useful, again, if you're going into a population that's undergoing chronic renal failure, and you want to know what's going on with the bone, you can use a descriptive model like this. Also included in this poster is what happens when there's a class of therapeutics out there that's called calcium sensing receptor agonists, and they actually feed in here and tell the PT, kind of fool the PT gland into thinking that there's more calcium than there really is, and so sort of combats the effect of this this decrease in calcitriol. There's a downstream effect of that, is that you end up actually adversely affecting the amount of calcium, and so you got to be careful with the dosing of a drug like that. There's also therapeutic interventions where vitamin D or active vitamin D is administered. Again, there's dose limitations to that because of the subsequent downstream effects on plasma calcium, and so we've used the model to explore some of that as well. So anyway, that's kind of an overview of that particular model, and you know, I didn't go through that just to show you that model itself. I really, the point that I hope to impose on you from all of that is why you may want to embark on building a model like this, as opposed to some of our more empirical approaches. The potential utility for these, you know, mechanistic or systems biology or multiscale models, really that we can use them to understand the system, predict the system, predict not just what we're observing, but things that we can't necessarily observe. One thing that I didn't talk about is that it's actually very difficult or near impossible to actually measure things like rank ligand levels, TGF-beta. Yet, when we have the model, we can actually get at least a prediction of what we think those different levels are doing over time under different disease states, under different therapeutic interventions. So we can use the model for disease progression. We can use it to understand the effects of dose and dose frequency, onset and offset of effects, whether there's tolerance or rebound occurring. And then one thing I haven't shown, but you can imagine too, that you could use this to say, okay, what if we combine therapies? What if we use therapies within specific disease states, etc.? And so again, getting back to that panoramic focus of these models, we aren't developing them just to understand sort of data in hand, but we're developing them to develop our overall knowledge of these systems. Points to consider. I think I've gone through a lot of this. This actually is a repeat of the first points here, just to rehash them. The data needs, the panoramic focus, which I just mentioned, and importantly is we need to continue to focus on this tool evolution. What we have currently to do this is suboptimal, and so we've got to kind of continue on with this. This idea of information capture, you know, we can use these models, hopefully, as I've given you a fairly decent example of, not just for one thing, but you can imagine using this type of information on cell signaling, et cetera, to feed back to the biologist and the chemist to say, you know what, this is an interesting target. This is an interesting pathway. Hey, what if we combine this therapy with this therapy? You know, do we have models for this disease state, animal type models for this disease state that we can start to probe and understand this? So not just from describing data, but also, you know, potentially as hypothesis generating as well. You know, the one point that I've touched on a little bit with this is the time and resources. You know, I said you aren't going to develop a model like this in parallel with a given development program. This model itself took about a year and a half to develop, and so it's got to be something that's done. You know, we continue to work on it today. It's now been several years in development because we continue to add on to it, and so it's something that you have to make the resource and time commitment to, and sort of choose wisely where you're going to do it. So that's it for my. Hopefully that wasn't too much of a diatribe on one thing, but again, there were certain points in that I wanted to get across, and I thought an example would be a good way to do that. What we'll do next is we'll set up the problem for this week, which is a bit of a simplification of what we were just looking at, but is really meant to pull together a lot of the concepts that we've dealt with in the last 3 or 4 weeks even of the of this particular course. So a question here about how the model was developed. There was an initial component of that model that we developed within NONMEM. Subsequent to that, we've switched into Berkeley Madonna, and as I mentioned, we're now looking at things like wind bugs and even R to further develop the model with variability inclusions. There is an intent to provide the code at some point, but not yet. We still have some cleaning and some development considerations before we release the code. But it will be at some point provided. That said, there's the publication, the bone publication that should be referenced within here has all of the differentials and all of the parameter estimates in it. It takes a little bit of work to get that out of there and into a software program, but it is available, and so the model can be sort of used publicly and further developed publicly as well. What I'm going to do is pause just a minute here before I go into the problem to see if there's any additional questions on that piece of it. Otherwise, we'll get into the setup of the problem for this week. Okay, so I don't see anything else coming through, so we'll proceed into the problem. So this is a kind of a hypothetical situation that I've put together here, but based on a real therapeutic target. And what I've done is taken sort of the observed data and come up with what I thought would be reasonable parameter estimates for a given model, and then simulated out some data. And so the challenge will be to see if you can sort of follow through that and develop a similar model. And so what I'll do here is I'll just kind of go through the background and the theory and give you some hints as to how to sort of tackle the problem, and then again we'll go through that in full on Friday. So here's one other question that's come through. If I understand correctly, the bone model was used to simulate, not fit, observations. It is right now being used to simulate observations. The data that I showed for denosumab and also for things like the once daily parathyroid hormone, those data were actually used to fit some of the model parameters that were more specific to sort of the pharmacology, if you will. And from there, it's being used to simulate. Now, that being said, it's sort of a recognition that Berkeley isn't the best software for model fitting. It uses fairly simplified sort of fitting algorithm to come up with estimates. But the point being is that there really weren't a lot of estimates that were fit. There's a fairly rich amount of data used to fit those. And again, those parameter estimates have held true when applied to other therapeutic conditions, as we've seen. And I've also mentioned that one of the tasks at hand right now is to take that model and those estimates for the model and place them into a program like WinBugs, where we can do things like global sensitivity analyses on those parameter estimates to determine the robustness of each of those estimates. And so that's work being done currently. Okay, so getting back here to the problem. So I've taken a situation here where we have a mechanism of action based on this cholesterol ester transfer protein, or CETP. And CETP is responsible for the transfer of triglycerides, TG here, and cholesterol esters between various lipoproteins. So there's the very low density lipoproteins that are produced by the liver, and they end up through time exchanging these triglycerides and cholesterol esters and becoming LDL particles full of cholesterol, and they go out and they cause all the cellular damage that is associated with cardiovascular disease and various other conditions. And then HDL is responsible for then going out and sort of scavenging up cholesterol and returning cholesterol to the liver, and thereby providing a clearance mechanism for cholesterol from the body. So it's sort of thought that LDL, bad cholesterol, HDL, good cholesterol, because this is cholesterol that's going out, is going to be causing damage. This is cholesterol associated with the high-density lipoproteins that's eventually going to go in and get cleared by the liver. So the prevailing thought has been that if you can raise HDL and lower LDL, that would be a great therapeutic agent. And by inhibiting CETP, that provides a mechanism that should, at least in theory, cause that to occur. And again, in theory at least, potentially cause a reduction in this oxidative damage. And so reduction in cardiovascular risk. So part of the theory as to why CETP works to do this, or inhibiting CETP to do this, is that as you increase the amount of cholesterol that's going into these HDL particles, the clearance of, for example, here this HDL2 is occurring more rapidly than clearance or removal of these HDL3s. And so if you block the transfer of cholesterol esters and sort of the buildup of these HDL2s, you're going to have more of these HDLs hanging around, and so your total HDL levels are going to go up in time. Likewise, if you block this conversion where things are moving more toward LDL1, LDL2, LDL3, these are actually cleared more slowly. Or maybe I said that incorrectly. I'm sorry, the HDL2s are cleared more quickly, and so by blocking them, you increase the amount of total HDL there is. These LDLs are cleared more slowly as they move from 2 to 3, and so by blocking this sort of conversion along here, these guys are cleared more quickly than these, and so you get a decrease in LDL. So that's sort of the theory behind how inhibition of CETP leads to an increase in HDL and a decrease in LDL. So I've come up with a hypothetical drug I've called CTEP, given it at 3 doses here, 12.5, 25, and 50 milligrams. 14 days of dosing. We've got PK measurements and PD measurements through day 19, so past the end of dosing. And a couple of notes about the PK and the PD here. So we have the PK, so these plasma concentrations, actually represent the total drug. So the amount that's bound, or the amount that's free, and also the amount that's bound to CETP. So one thing about this drug is that it actually goes in and it binds with CETP and within the plasma. And then when you measure the total drug concentration, the processes that you use actually end up measuring the total amount of drug, not just the free amount of drug. So you get the bound plus the free. So for this, if you think about the target-mediated drug disposition models, oftentimes we're writing them in terms of describing a free concentration. We don't know the total concentration. In this particular example, we know the total, but we don't know the free. We also have measurements of the actual enzyme here, so the CETP. We have that at baseline, so we know where people started. But as the drug binds to it, we actually see an increase in total CETP over time. And again, we have a measurement of this. We don't have a measurement of free, we don't have a measurement of bound, but we have a measurement of total CETP. So again, we've got total drug and we've got total CETP. On top of that, we also have a measurement of the activity of this CETP. So there's a bioassay here, an ex vivo bioassay, where they're able to, at a given time, measure the relative activity of the CETP, and it's expressed as a relative activity to baseline. So in other words, it's the amount of inhibition that you'll have at any time to this CETP. In the data set I'm going to show, it's marked in as compartment 4. The total CETP concentration is compartment 5. PK is compartment 2. And then we also have measures of serum HDL cholesterol, and that's in the data set as compartment 6. So what I call data musings here, some thoughts on the data. Again, I mentioned that we have total concentrations of CETP and total concentrations of drug. So can we model this? The hint here is that we're going to use a target-mediated drug disposition model. So again, I'm trying to give an example here of not just multiple endpoint data and mechanistic data, but trying to feed this back into some of the earlier lectures as well. Another thing that's noted when you look at this data is if you plot this CETP inhibition data, or the relative activity data, versus the measured drug concentration, which is the total concentration, you see an interesting thing, that you actually get less inhibition for the same total drug concentration on day 14 compared to day 1. And so the question is does this make sense? Is it just noise in the data? Is it something wrong with the assay? Did they do the assay based on day 1 and then they reran the assay on a different day for the day 14? You go back to your biologist and they say, no, we ran all the samples together, we randomized them, so that doesn't make sense. So does it make sense? Can you actually model this change, or this apparent tolerance that's occurring from day 1 to day 14. And so the hint here is to actually, if you think of the activity of CETP, really what that represents is the amount of CETP that's still available, that's unbound, not bound to the inhibitor. So if you take the ratio of the free CETP at any time after dosing compared to the amount that is there at baseline, that should represent the relative activity of CETP for then moving on to drive the pharmacodynamic response. And then the question is, can we use all this information to then predict out HDL cholesterol, and can we then use that to optimize our dose and also understand what may happen with longer treatments? And again, we can drive this off of sort of the relative CETP activity, which is based on the fraction of free CETP at any time versus the amount that was available at baseline. Got a couple of questions. I'll show you the data next. I'll post those data up after this lecture. And let me just dig through some questions here. Yeah, so somebody kind of saw through this already from the PK side. You notice that the PK is in compartment 2, and I don't start the PD until compartment 4, and so that's kind of a giveaway that you're going to use a 2-compartment model to describe the data. Or maybe I just had I wasn't sure, and so I had the data set up this way. But I'll give it to you that it's a 2-compartment model that you're going to use for the PK. The compartment 4 is a measurement of activity, so it's like an inhibition assay. So you'll see there that I believe it starts at 0, so you have 0 inhibition at first, and then it moves on up to upwards of 100% inhibition. So that's really the 100 minus the activity, the relative activity. And if you think of relative activity is based on the amount of free CETP there is. That if CETP is bound, it can't do what it needs to do. It can't be involved in this process. So as soon as you bind CETP, it becomes inactive. So if you have 100% of the CETP bound, you're going to have 100% inhibition. So your amount in compartment 4 is going to be 100. If you have no CETP bound, then CETP activity is going to be, or your inhibition is going to be 0. And you're going to be able to be involved in that exchange process for triglycerides and cholesterol esters at the same rate that you normally are. And the difference is that as you change from all of the CETP being bound to none of the CETP being bound, that relative fraction of the amount bound over baseline is really a direct measure of this percent inhibition. As you develop the model, if you do that ratio, you can actually see that relationship play out, and we'll look at that as we work. If you can't quite get a grasp on it, we'll work through that on Friday during the lab session. Okay, so just a quick look here at the data itself, just to, again, give you an idea of what these data sets look like as you look at multiple endpoint data. so we've got our in this case, it's a combination where we have to look at the PK as well as the PD. We can't do this sequential fit because we have this target-mediated drug disposition. And so, so we have our PK record in here, where in this case, this individual is getting a 12.5 milligram dose. They're going to get 13 additional doses, so this in every 24 hours. So this represents the 14 days of dosing. And that's going into compartment 1, so the oral dosing compartment, EVID 1 for a dosing event. In compartment 2 is the PK. At time 0, there's nothing in there. Compartment 4 is the relative inhibition, so there's no drug in there, so the inhibition, and this is actually the observed data, so there's no inhibition, so that's sort of your baseline. Compartment 5 is this total amount of CETP in the plasma, and so that starts out right around 2. In compartment 6 is your baseline HDL cholesterol level, right around 41 milligrams per deciliter. And so, again, that's where you start out. Now, you give the drug half hour later, you start to see some drug concentration in there, about 41 nanograms per ml. You begin to see some inhibition. You're only at about 3% inhibition. And then an hour later, so you get PK measurements, early on here, and you're also during that time looking at inhibition at the same time. So you can see as PK increases, your inhibition increases. So down here, you're now up at 68 nanograms per ml, and you've got about 22% inhibition. When you get up to 80 nanograms per ml, you're at 61% inhibition. So again, you start to see that concentration response occurring over the time course. And then after 1 day, you can see in compartment 5 that the total amount of that CETP has now increased from a value of about 2 up to a value of about 2.9. The reason for that is that, again, that's a measurement of both the total and the free. And so obviously the clearance of this bound complex is slower than the clearance of the CETP unbound. And so when you bind it up, you get an increase in the total amount. And then, so here you actually see that the cholesterol's gone down. That's very likely just a manifestation of residual variability. And then at 48 hours, you start to see now that HDL cholesterol is starting to go up a little bit. It's at 45, bounces back down later. So again, there's some noise in the data. When you look at it over the course of the 2 weeks, you'll see that gradual increase in HDL cholesterol. You can see that in compartment 5 here, if you look, that the total amount of CETP is increasing. One interesting point that it's not shown here in the entirety of the data, but similar to what we have on day 1 here, where we have a fairly robust number of samples with PK and this inhibition. Also within the fuller data set, we've repeated that on day 14. And so there, if you plotted day 1 and day 14 together of this CETP inhibition versus total drug concentration, you'd see this apparent tolerance occurring on day 14 relative to day 1. So that may be something that you want to look at as you try to make some sense of this data. This is entirely hypothetical, entirely simulated data. I've taken these 2 publications, so one by a group at Pfizer, another by a group at Merck, looked at the data, sort of figured out what likely parameter estimates would be to get observations close to what they reported, and have then simulated from that. So this is really a hypothetical case mimicking reality. So I think that's it. And actually, looking at the time, we're right on the edge of 4 o'clock here. So again, I will post this up. I'll post up the solution, or this data set. I'll post up the solution to last week's lab, and then the recording of this lecture also will be posted up. Any questions, let me know between now and Friday. Otherwise, we'll go through this example during lab on Friday. Thanks, everybody.